Can the Chinese Communist Party simultaneously be the greatest national security threat to the United States and also a party, and thus a country, in decline? That seems to be what our next guest argues. He is Stephen Mosher. He's the president of the Population Research Institute. He's an expert on China dating back some 40 years from an academic perspective. He's also the author of the recently released book, I think it's his 10th on China, The Devil in Communist China from Mao Down to Xi. The Devil in Communist China from Mao Down to Xi is the book. I had the occasion to record a podcast with Stephen Mosher that will be available next week for a more wide-ranging conversation on China. He's very, very knowledgeable. It's really interesting. We covered a lot of ground, and we'll try to cover as much as we can here as well. Stephen Mosher, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, it's good to be here with you, Dan and Amy.
So explain that seeming dichotomy. It's an existential threat to the United States. We've got a select committee that was chaired by Representative Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin on the Chinese Communist Party, and at the same time, it is a party and thus a country in decline. And so, how should we understand what our posture should be?
Well, I mean, China had a good run, but it's now over. I mean, the demographic collapse is ongoing. They eliminated 400 million unborn children in the one-child policy, which ran for 36 years. Those workers, those women, those men who would have created families and had children of their own, they're gone. And China's population is aging and dying more rapidly than any human population has ever aged and died. So that's strike one. Strike two is they've overbuilt. I mean, my goodness, they've got 65 million empty apartments. They've got ghost cities all over the country because they overbuilt. They've got empty shopping malls. They've got half-constructed high-rise apartment buildings. And they've got tens of millions of people who invested their life savings into those projects, only to find the companies that were supposedly building those apartments and retail outlets have gone bankrupt. The money is gone. And then, of course, you've got the best evidence that China is on the decline is you've got tens of thousands of people from China crossing illegally our southern border. I mean, over the last 12 months, about 40,000 from China. The numbers are staggeringly increased over the last couple of years. So there's a huge pool of money and people desperate to get out of China because it's a country in decline. That doesn't mean it's any less dangerous. Mm-hmm. That may, in fact, make it more dangerous. I mean, Xi Jinping, with his back against the wall domestically, might seek a foreign adventure. In fact, he seems to be doing just that with vis-a-vis Japan and Taiwan and the South China Sea, the Philippines right now.
And so when I'm sure when people that work for multinational corporations that may have a presence in China, big manufacturers, social media companies, car makers, Elon Musk, when they hear that, they're probably having a tough time reconciling that too. Do you think that corporate America appreciates where China is and maybe where their interests lie? I mean, to say changing the distribution of their resources and supply lines out of China more quickly than has been done up to this point?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Dan, because you saw that begin under President Trump in 2017, 2018, with the first round of the tariffs. Now, a company like Apple, headed by Tim Cook, or like Tesla, headed by Elon Musk, which has huge investments in China, is basically hostage to the regime. I mean, what are they going to do? They don't want to shut down their factory. They don't want to alienate the Chinese Communist Party leader, Xi Jinping, because he could shut them out of the domestic market overnight. Basically, they could regulate Tesla in China out of existence, Apple Watches and iPods and all the rest out of existence in China. That's why when Xi Jinping came to San Francisco, these guys were all there to dinner clapping for him, paying $40,000 a seat. They want to stay on the good side of the dictator because he can close them out of the domestic market overnight. So they're captive. They're captive. They've got too much money invested in China. There's no way to get it out, by the way. Currency transfers out of China are very difficult. So they're stuck, quite frankly.
Well, how did the Trump tariffs in 2018, still in place today, set China back on its heels?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Amy. This was a partial compensation, the Trump tariffs, for the subsidies that the Communist Party provides to export industries. You know, China has two economies. It has, along the coast, it has the export sector of the economy, which is the only economy that really works according to market principles and makes money. The rest of the economy is in the doldrums. It's largely dominated by state-owned enterprises, which are white elephants that require huge state subsidies every year. And China cheats on currency. It cheats on trade. It sells goods sometimes at below the cost of manufacturing them. What do you do to compensate for that? So what do you do to allow a level playing field for not for free trade, but for fair trade, to keep American workers employed? Well, you put tariffs on Chinese goods. The tariffs actually need to be raised, and I'd like to see 10% tariffs across the board. But we've already seen a relocation of factories back to the United States, to Mexico, to Canada, to India, the countries that respect our values and institutions, rather than a country that, quite frankly, is headed by a communist party that wants to destroy us.
Well, so if the recommendation is to go after China's export economy to further cripple the regime, then don't you fear, and wouldn't Tim Cook and Elon Musk fear, that one easy path to retribution is to punish those American-based global companies like Apple and Tesla? And it seems to me that a choice that has to be made is that a policy choice you're going to make and risk that and risk the repercussions in the domestic market, because something's got to give here, right?
Well, you really do have to protect the manufacturing base of the United States. Economic nationalism is national security. You've got to be able to make things in the United States, and you can't source. You can't build ships and planes and tanks and other things to defend the country if you're dependent upon component parts that come from your principal adversary in the world. That makes no sense. What's going to happen in the event of a conflict? You're not going to be able to access those component parts. So you've got to decouple from China. I don't think there's any way to manage the relationship so that we can live peacefully together. That's been the dream for the last 40 years. I've lived through it for the last 40 years. I was the first American social scientist in China back in 1979, 1980. We all hoped that China was going our way. It didn't happen. They are now reverting to type. They are still a one-party dictatorship headed down the socialist road to ruin, and they still desire and hunger to dominate larger parts of the world and to replace the United States as the dominant power in the world. That is simply a fact, however much we wish it weren't so. And so we've got to deal with the reality that China believes that this is a you live, I live, you die scenario. That's how you say it in Chinese, a fight to the death. Ni su wo huo, in Chinese. So, we've got to recognize that reality and decouple. Let's have closer economic ties to our allies in Asia, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, India. Let's bring industry back to the United States and open some of those 70,000 factories that were shuttered because China cheats on trade and manipulates its currency and subsidizes exports. I think that would be good for America. It'd certainly be good for American workers. Let's bring the Rust Belt back to life.
We've talked too about, of course, China's influence in international institutions. Let's talk about the World Health Organization as an obvious example, particularly because of the ravages of COVID response, the policies in response to the COVID virus. And now we have some talk emanating from China about avian flu again.
Oh boy.
And I wonder about this is not a conspiracy, it's a question. Disease warfare. I think it's pretty more likely than not that the COVID virus emanated from that Wuhan virology lab. But regardless of whether it did or it didn't, China's handling of it with respect to the rest of the world was not exactly honorable. And so and maybe it was incompetence, maybe it was purposeful, maybe it's a combination of the two. But what about that scenario replaying itself with another virus, and maybe particularly if China is nearing the death throes, as you suggest, maybe more purposeful if that's possible this time around?
Well, Dan, I've written a book about pandemics and world history, and it turns out that since the Chinese Communist Party took power in China, they have actually released 4 pandemics on the world. The first was the Asian flu, 1957, 1958, the Hong Kong flu, 67, 68, SARS-1 back in 2003, and then, of course, COVID in 2020. And the reason I say they released it on the world is the first 3 of those were what's called zoonotic. I mean, they came from nature. Clearly, it was a virus that passed from nature into a human being in China and then spread in China. Why do I say they spread it throughout the world? I've said this in print, by the way, in the New York Post and other outlets last year. I say that because they knew they had a dangerous new virus on the loose. They knew they had an epidemic in China. They did not, in 1957-58, tell the World Health Organization or the world. They did not, in 67-68, with the Hong Kong flu, tell the World Health Organization or the world. They did not, in 2003, tell us about SARS-1, which could have been much more deadly than the coronavirus epidemic. But fortunately, our Canadian neighbors, Canadian intelligence, caught intelligence intercepts in China about a dangerous new pathogen on the loose, and we confronted Beijing officials, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've got this disease down in southern China, which is killing 12% of the people it infects. 12%. So this is a pattern, Dan. This is not the first time they have deliberately released a virus on the world. So I think it's quite deliberate. And by the way, I said in February, very early on, and got canceled for it, February of 2020, that all roads led to the Wuhan lab. And nothing I've learned in the years since has convinced me otherwise.
What is the stability of the dictator? The top dictator there, since they're all part of a dictatorial class. I'm talking about Xi, of course. What is his stability as the autocrat at the head of the Communist Party and thus the country? Is there, it's sort of the kind of same conversation we have about Putin. Is there any sort of palace intrigue where he could be deposed, popular uprising or something else that would change the trajectory of China?
Well, I mean, there's always palace intrigue in China. I mean, the infighting within the top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party is unimaginably brutal, and often results in imprisonment of offending parties. So what you have in China today is a person modeling himself on Chairman Mao Zedong, who was basically, by the end of his life, by the end of the Cultural Revolution, the absolute dictator of China. He was also megalomaniac, and in his final years, he was paranoid. So paranoid, in fact, that he had his principal rivals in the party killed by the Red Guards, and even his chief supporter, Zhou Enlai, he let die of cancer because he forbid the doctors to treat Zhou Enlai, who had been his premier for decades, his right-hand man, for bladder cancer, and let it spread throughout his intestines and eventually kill him in great pain. Why did he do that? Because he feared the rise of a rival, even among his friends. We see the same behavior on the part of Xi Jinping. At a few months ago, there was a party congress, and Xi Jinping's one supporter among the top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party for the last 15 years was the former president, Hu Jintao. President Hu had backed Xi Jinping from the beginning. It's why Xi Jinping is the head of China today, because he had the backing from Hu Jintao and his faction. And what happened during the last party congress? Hu Jintao was lifted out of his seat by the head of Xi Jinping's security force and taken out of the room. Why? Because he complained about the fact that his faction had not been given any seats on the Politburo, and apparently an agreement he had with Xi Jinping was violated. Anyway, the internecine warfare, the warfare between the factions, came out in the open, and the last faction, aside from Xi Jinping's, was publicly humiliated in front of 400 members of the Central Committee and alternate members of the Central Committee. Xi Jinping has an absolute grasp on power today in China. He's known as the chairman of everything. He's the chairman of the military commission. He's the head of the government. He's the head of the party. He's the head of all these other groups that have been set up in the government. He sidelined the premier. The number 2 guy doesn't even come out in public anymore. He's probably afraid to say anything or do anything because Xi Jinping will see him as a rival and have him removed as well.
Well, the man that was removed, what happened to him?
Well, he was said to have had health problems. Well, I
Sure.
bet he did.
Yeah.
How convenient. You
I
have a
don't
health
know.
problem now, buddy.
So
But-
what you're saying, so she is the chairman of everything. So he's sort of like to the Chinese Communist Party or to China what Larry Fink is to corporate America. I got it. That now that makes sense. So this is going to get. In terms of the Chinese Communist Party, this is going to get more contentious and uglier before and if it ever gets better.
Well, it is, and because Xi Jinping had a successor when he took office, someone who's being groomed to take over the presidency in 2023. Well, that didn't happen. He had that guy charged with corruption years ago, and he's spending the rest of his life in prison. So there's no successor, and all of the other factions have been destroyed. And so it's only Xi Jinping's faction at the top of the power pyramid in China. What happens when Xi Jinping dies? There's going to be a vicious power struggle among his own subordinates, the people he trusted. And we don't know how that's going to turn out. We also know that there are demographic problems, economic problems, problems with the export sector of the economy. So all of this is coming to a head. And, whether China, we don't know.
Stephen Mosher, president of the Population Research Institute. He's an expert on China, as you've heard. He's the author of the recently released book, The Devil and Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. Stephen Mosher, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Dan and Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Very informative, and we'll have you back. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The following is a paid political announcement.
Governor Pritzker's State Board of Education policy is that public schools can socially transition and counsel children that they are a sex other than their biological sex without telling their parents. Send a message to Springfield that we will not allow the government to make decisions for our children without parental consent. Help Parents Matter Coalition get an advisory question on the 2024 ballot about parental rights. Visit parentsmattercoalition.org to get involved now. That's parentsmattercoalition.org. Paid for by the Parents Matter Coalition.
Oh, if you have problems walking down your stairs, some people go down their stairs sideways because their knees hurt. Some don't even want to get up when the phone rings because they're in such chronic pain. You do not have to live like that anymore. And if you're afraid of surgery or steroids and drugs, look no further than our good friends at QC Kinetics. QC Kinetics is the future of medicine. QC is the nation's leader and the most exciting revolutionary in pain management we've seen in decades. Pro athletes have been doing this for years, so be like them. It's regenerative medicine. So if you're tired of those achy joints, if your joint pain is